recognize, my God, it's so good to see you. You know who you are. Really, really nice to see you. Okay, well, I wanted to thank Julie Resche for, for pushing me to do this, because I wouldn't do anything if she didn't encourage me, and I always resist, but I always end up doing it anyway. In this case, I'd also like to thank the Global Center for Advanced Studies for kind of platforming this a little bit for me, which is really helpful at a time when I don't have a classroom, but it looks like some members of my classroom are following me. It's really cool to see that, my former classroom. Okay, so I'm gonna be honest, I'm not really prepared for today. Which is, well, for some of you, you already know that's normal. But let's see what I can do. I think I'd like to begin with a statement that I made a few months ago while nearing the end of a seminar for some students in Russia, some of whom are here right now. And it's so damn nice to see you. You know, when I speak, I surprise myself. It's because I permit myself the freedom to ramble, the opportunity to ramble, to just sort of say whatever. I mean, I have some things jotted down, a few quotes that I just grabbed a few moments ago that hopefully will help to orient me today. But you know, that allows me to surprise myself when I get to ramble and kind of speak freely. But maybe that's not exactly what you would call teaching. But it has pedagogical effects. When I speak as a teacher, it's as if I'm involved in a psychoanalytic session. You know, I'm surprised. Typically, it happens also when you're in analysis. You're surprised. I'm surprised by my own speech, by what I have to say, my own bullshit. And it was an important part of undergoing psychoanalysis for Freud. He named it parapraxis. And in his work on dreams, he made this distinction, maybe some of you know it, between latent content. Well, he talked about the latent content, which was discoverable through interpretation of the manifest content, psychoanalytic interpretation. Lacan even made this distinction, right? In his earlier teaching, some of you know, between empty and full speech, which was somewhat similar. The latter, full speech, invokes a meaning that's susceptible to psychoanalytic interpretation. Anyway, what I said to those students in Russia, some of whom I'm staring at, it's a surprise to see you, actually. What I said was surprising to the students in Russia, but it didn't imply that there was some sort of deeper meaning to be interpreted from it, some sort of deeper meaning buried inside of it. I remain committed to the statement that surprised me. What I said was that there are no genuine revolutionaries without melancholia. And I know that that statement will irritate some clinicians. Oh, Jared, nice to see you. For many of them, clinicians, melancholia is a really serious condition that involves, you know, among other things, it involves suicidal ideation. So I'm not trying to challenge that position by playing loose with the definition, but that's what I said. And I don't want to repeat all of the heavy lifting that brought me to make that claim. But what is melancholia? Depression. Put simply, it exists not as you might expect when you discover that your world has collapsed, but rather when you realize precisely that you never had that world from the very beginning. In these circumstances, there's nothing, in a weird sort of paradoxical way, there's nothing but world. It's a world of profound I guess the hip phrase is subjective destitution, a world of profound subjective destitution, to put it mildly. The melancholic cannot seem to conquer a place for herself in the world. I'm rephrasing sort of something that Lacan said about the psychotic. Melancholia was for Lacan among the psychoses. I would even claim that melancholia, or that the melancholic experiences only revolution. Lacan once reminded his students that, and here's one of the quotes I collected, that the word revolution means, I quote him, to return to the same. Hence, in the 1970s, he said, I quote him, this term revolution, in the use made of it in the mechanics of heavenly bodies, the stars, means a return to the same. It's funny because in the quote, I made a slip even in the quote. I wrote a return to the state, and I actually really like that quote, that slip. And he added, quote, the master's discourse accomplishes its own revolution in the sense of doing a complete circle, end quote. Okay, how do we read this? I take it to imply that there's something real at stake in his conception of revolution. And I'm surprised by that. I'm surprised to discover that Lacan was actually quite interested in revolutions. Hey, Wan Young. My God, so cool to see so many people here. The concept of the real was pivotal for Lacan. And maybe you already know that at one point he gave this definition of the real as that which, I think I'm quoting him, always returns to its place. The real is that which always returns to its place. His example was precisely the movement of heavenly bodies again, when he talked about the real and when he talked about revolutions. So it seems as though the concept of the real is, and that of revolution, are in some ways, if not homologous, at least synonymous. There's a real at stake in Melancholia, and that's revolutionary, and that forces us to reflect also on the concepts, somewhat more people I recognize, that forces us to reflect, I'm just gonna keep saying this every time I see a familiar face. It forces us to reflect upon the concepts of repetition, circularity, fixation, which are close terms for the concept of revolution. The melancholic is the one for whom there's most certainly a revolution, but without there being any need, no, let's put it like this, without there being any place for herself in the world. That's what differentiates the melancholic from the hysteric in psychoanalysis. The latter, the hysteric, in the first instance, confronts a world. The hysterical subject situates her revolutionary desires, aspirations, her revolutionary aspirations in some relation to the world of mastery. It doesn't imply that it works out very well for the hysteric, because it often doesn't. But she demands something from the world. She demands that there be a transgression of the laws which sustain that world. She's not necessarily the instrument of the world, as it is in perversion, but she does aim to expose the world's inadequacies and to force the world, or the master, to take stock of itself. But even in doing all of that, she remains subjected to the world of mastery. For example, the hysteric will come inside the walls of your world for no other reason than to demand that you go outside the world. Actually, that's exactly what a revolutionary student did during one of Lacan's seminars. The student interrupted Lacan in order to demand that he stop teaching, that he stop speaking, and teaching is to speak. The demand was for him to go outside of his speech. I'm going to quote the incident. If I can find it one moment. Okay, the student says, if we are to overthrow the university, the bourgeois university, if you like, if we're to overthrow the university, it will be from the outside, with others who are on the outside. And then somebody shouts, why are you inside? The student says, I'm inside, comrade, because if I want people to leave, I have to come inside to tell them. Lacan says, somewhat surprised, he says, ah, you see, everything's there, my friend. In order to get them to go out, you come in. End quote. It's an interesting dialogue. Maybe the hysteric goes inside so that she can preach the gospel of going outside. Yet it's not true of the melancholic. The melancholic experiences revolution without a place for herself in the world and without aspirations. So I think the concept of revolution is a real pivot between hysteria and melancholia. And I think that's what leads us to a few surprises. So for example, when Lacan once said to the revolutionary students, I have it here, quote, as revolutionaries, what you aspire to is a master, end quote. What you aspire to is a master, end quote. You know, after all these years since I first read that statement, and it wasn't that long ago, but it was quite a while ago. It was more than 10 years ago the first time I read that statement. I went looking for it because I was pivoting between anarchism and psychoanalysis. But after all these years, it still surprises me, that statement. I was surprised again last night. I wish I could see Hugh here. Maybe he's watching live. I was surprised last night because a friend of mine, new friend, he provided me with another reading of that statement. Anyway, it's likely that the statement also surprised Lacan because he didn't plan on saying it. But that's the point. Hysteria is precisely that. It's a big surprise. Hysteria is a big surprise. But for whom is it a surprise? On the one hand, it's a surprise for those who attempt to relate to the hysteric, maybe form a couple with the hysteric. It's a big surprise. I wouldn't recommend it. On the other hand, it's a surprise precisely for the hysteric herself. And it was a point that was made years ago by Jacques Lacan. He said quite simply, I couldn't tell you where he said it, I don't remember, but he said, hysteria is the surprise package. Hysteria is the surprise package. It doesn't work out well for partners who don't like surprises, he says, something like that. Well, I would say there's many people today who don't like to be surprised, who don't like surprises. It's probably part of our contemporary condition. My concern is that anarchists stopped being surprised by the world around them. Anyway, Miller went on to remind us that the hysteric is never where her partner expects her to be, based upon what he believes he knows about her. We can use different pronouns. It doesn't have to be he and her and so on. It can be any pronoun. But it was a fundamental point, and I think it was a really clear point. It helped to orient me on the question of the hysteric's truth. I just said it, the hysteric's truth. It helped to orient me, and it was clear, but it didn't make things any more understandable. It only leads me to more confusion, actually. I feel more confused today than I ever was. The expression, the hysteric's truth. I don't know if Lacan ever actually said it, like as pointedly as that, but I know Ellie Raglan did. She made it the title of an essay, The Hysteric's Truth. She's never where you expect her to be because she's not entirely captured by the world of meaning, of speech. There can be no psychoanalysis without surprises, I think. Psychoanalysis has been fundamentally oriented by surprises of all sorts. It's why we can claim that psychoanalysis really began as an outcome of a hysterical revolution. And psychoanalysts attempted to make the surprise the motor of their discourse, the analytic discourse, by beginning with what they call objet petit a, the object cause of desire. That's what Lacan called it, objet petit a. And it's a confusing concept for me. I'm barely oriented by it because it takes different shapes during during different periods of Lacan's teaching. And to get a sense of some of these shifts in the concept of objet petit a, you could read, I recommend it, an essay by Jacques Lacan titled 6 Paradigms of Jouissance. But at around the time of the impromptu session with these revolutionary students, 1969 or whatever it was, just after the uprisings in France, 1968, just after that. It was around this time that I think around this time that the objet petit a, the object cause of desire, was resituated to account for a renewed interest in the relationship of the unconscious and what are called the drives, or what Lacan called the drive, or what I would just call for today, the impulse. It's not a very good word, but I'm using it. It's not long after this that objet petit a became understood as a void, which means that it was something missing from within the symbolic world, the symbolic order. Put another way, it was related to that which resists being inscribed within the symbolic coordinates of a world, something like that. That was what happened to the little object cause of desire. It became a void. So I say that the hysterical subject is the one for whom jouissance, a word I'll explain more as I go on, for whom jouissance is resolutely and inescapably enigmatic from the standpoint of the world and its symbolic inscriptions or whatever. It's not exactly clear to me what I'm saying. And I'm not sure where I'm going actually with this. But something does become cleared away when I say it like that, for me. I really wish Hugh was here because I like this word clear. I like it because I was told by Hugh yesterday in Dublin that that clarity is one of the Cartesian virtues. That's what he told me. I didn't know that. I like it, but nothing's clear to me. Nothing's clear to me yet in what I'm saying. I'm confused, and I'm in Clare, Ireland, County Clare. What I've mentioned so far, I think, nonetheless produces a clearing away of knowledge from jouissance. It's a clearing. There's a disjunction of knowledge, the sort of knowledge that we might be interpreted in terms of meaning on the one hand, and jouissance on the other. So maybe what I'm saying is not altogether virtuous because it's not clear, but maybe if I can learn to speak well of it as the course goes on, I will nonetheless find my virtue. For now, I'll just keep rambling. I was thinking that it's really difficult for psychoanalysis to continue or psychoanalysts if they don't like surprises. There's even some psychoanalysts, or those in the psychoanalytic orientation, on Facebook, for example, who really like surprises, who enjoy them, I've noticed. Maybe they're watching. Endlessly playing with language, making jokes, endless jokes, endless wordplay, unclear, inclair, and so on, this sort of stuff. But it's endless, always producing double entendres and so on. For them, there's nothing but the playfulness of language. That's not the approach that I take. But this point about the disjuncture of knowledge and jouissance, I think it allows us to advance a little further than some so-called anarchists. If you say that fast, it sounds like psychoanalysts. Because they provided readings of psychoanalysis and revolution by focusing on hysteria and desire, without it all plunging into what I would call the darkness of the drives, of jouissance, enigmatic jouissance. Some of them have even claimed they've isolated the basic ontological presuppositions of classical anarchism, and that they've revealed that anarchists have had this uncritical essentialist position with respect to human nature, which led them to a claim that the classical anarchists had a simplistic or a reductive account of political revolution. You know, if human nature is essentially good and creative, and if the master is essentially or exclusively repressive, then you just have to get rid of the master. And we can all hold hands and join the human fraternity, the communist fraternity, or whatever. What I find interesting about this moment in anarchist thinking, the post-anarchist moment, was that it nonetheless produced a surprise among anarchists. It surprised us. It surprised anarchists all around the world. They were surprised by what the post-anarchists revealed to them about what they were saying, what they had already been saying. Suddenly, the post-anarchist critique of classical anarchist ontology and epistemology, it occurred, and there was a jolt of surprise among anarchists. And it was perhaps most surprising to the post-anarchists, who were, most of them were anarchists. So it was surprising to the anarchists themselves. And just like that, the anarchists began to work hard to demonstrate that there was already another scene within anarchist theory, another scene. They started like digging into the classical literature, finding literature that wasn't yet talked about as if it were anarchist. Bataille is now an anarchist. You start going, everybody's an anarchist now, and this sort of stuff was going on. They started showing us that the classical texts are not homogeneous, like many of the post-anarchists claimed them to be, or seemed to be claiming them to be. This is what they did. They aimed to show us that there was another way of reading anarchist theory, the anarchist theory of power, of subjectivity, and all this other stuff. It was already there in the classical tradition, they said. You just overlooked it. It means that the post-anarchists and the anarchists were fighting with each other, but nonetheless, they were both pursuing the same consequences of a surprise. They were both surprised. It was an engagement with the unconscious. And what mattered at that moment, I think, wasn't about who had the correct reading, the correct interpretation of the classical anarchist literature or canon or whatever. But what mattered was the fact that we were surprised by what we were saying. I suddenly realize I'm repeating the word surprise, so I feel like that's important. We were surprised by what we were saying already and what we had already said in the anarchist tradition. That's what mattered. And I wonder if there's any surprises left for anarchism. Not much has been said yet about the incompatibility or the non-rapport, non-relationship of jouissance and the world in the anarchist tradition. The mystery, the so-called mystery of hysteria, was thought to be mastered by many of the post-anarchists. They think they got it. They figured it out. I say they, I was one of them. I propose that instead we begin to move backward from mastery to mystery, from meaningful knowledge back to the enigma, to the surprise. By the way, the word surprise has two meanings. You know that? it means on the one, I mean, if you look into its etymology, it means, on the one hand, it means to be captured or mastered. That's what it could mean. Surprise, to be captured or mastered. On the other hand, it could mean that you're astonished by something unexpected or contingent. You're something like that. So on the one hand, you could say that you're mastered by the symbolic unconscious. So, you know, when some post-anarchists wrote about hysteria and revolution, they focused on this unacknowledged dependence upon the world of mastery. The hysteric doesn't acknowledge that they're dependent in some sense on the world of mastery. And you know, like, for example, it was the position of my good friend, I really like him, Saul Newman. I feel myself closest to his position. Saul Newman, who wrote a few books on post-anarchism and lots of articles and so on. Particularly in some of his earlier work, when he was writing, I don't know when that was, 15 years ago or something. I'm old, fuck my life. So when he was writing about this Nietzschean concept of resentment, enslaved morality. It was also the position of Richard J.F. Day, in a way, when he was discussing, maybe you know it in his book, Gramsci is Dead, what did he call it? A loop-back structure. The loop-back structure of reform or revolution. The loop-back structure of reform or revolution, which is dominant in a lot of counter-hegemonic social movements, he said. For him, these movements were captured by what he named the circular politics of demand. That's what he called it, politics of demand. Okay, we could cite all kinds of literature. That's just two. For Lacan, it's only the analyst discourse that offers a revolution without the world of mastery and with a place for the subject, or something like that. The big secret of hysteria is that she's ultimately not entirely in the world. That's what I understand from it. She's not entirely in the world. That's why Lacan seemed to, I think I'm going to bother some people at this point, surprise. He retained this link among hysteria and femininity. It's going to upset some of you who are not in favor of surprises. He located a link among hysteria and I'm going to say it, the essence of femininity, of the feminine position. And it was in the logic of what he called the not all, the patu, the not all, N-O-T, all. The not all highlights an exception to the laws of the world. It's not a universal position. That would make it an all. The not all remains enigmatic. Marie-Hélène Bruce pointed out that, I really encourage you to read some of her work, Marie-Hélène Bruce, B-R-O-U-S-S-E. She pointed out that in hysteria, it's important to think not only about a revolutionary response to the world of mastery. Hysteria is also a response to the real. It's a really important point. Hysteria is also a defense against revolutions. Or against revolution, against the real. Put another way, hysteria is a response to the master just as much as it's a response to the mystery. In both cases, there can be something like what some psychoanalysts call a ravage. Psychoanalysts will often mistake hysteria and melancholy, psychotic melancholy, because of this concept of ravage. But the key difference, I think, is that the hysteric makes, I don't know, victimization the point of departure upon which to launch her interrogation of the master, while the melancholic remains committed to the mystery. There's no secrets, there's no surprises. So that's what's at stake in hysteria. Ultimately, Um, ultimately, it concerns this enigmatic and unspeakable jouissance. It's a jouissance that's anarchic and revolutionary. And it's a jouissance that's uncoupled from the world. The melancholic understands this big secret, the hysteric's truth. The world is radically without foundation. And the melancholic knows about the profound violence of the world and of speech. For the melancholic, the secret is really, truly out. That's why knowing the big secret doesn't make life any easier. By the way, I'm in Ireland right now. I know I mentioned it already, but I'm in Ireland, and I was reminded the other day, well, this is, it's largely Catholic part of Ireland. And I was reminded that in Catholicism, there's this, I don't know what to call it, this refrain, the mystery of faith, the mystery of faith. I remember hearing it every Sunday when I was a kid in Canada, when I went to church. Let us proclaim the mystery of faith. What is the mystery of faith? Quite simply, it's the secret as such. Something radically without meaning. The mystery of faith is not some meaning to be solved. It's a pure enigma. There was actually, come to think of it, this one theosopher, I think he was a theosopher, who claimed that he knew what the secret of faith was in Catholicism, and he claimed you can find it in the Tetragrammaton, which is a pure writing, and I find that interesting. But anyway, it's a digression. None of this stops, I would say, the melancholic from engaging in what seems to be self-sabotaging behavior. However, it happens along a different track than what we see in hysteria. The hysteric sabotages, I don't know if that's the right word, sabotages, I can't think of a better word right now, but the hysteric sabotages her desire in order to sustain the very space within which her subjectivity is split in relation to the world. And that's a solution to the real. But the melancholic sabotages the very split of subjectivity. Sabotages the possibility of subjectivity being split. I don't know how else to put it. The cut that should have occurred from the world into jouissance, it didn't happen. And so it sometimes instead, because it didn't happen with language, with the world, it happens with like a razor blade. Forgive the strong imagery, but it happens, if it doesn't happen with the word, the name, it happens with a razor blade or with a pill. The cut that should have occurred from the world into jouissance didn't happen. In such cases, I would say the revolution outlives her, overcomes her. You know what I'm imagining? I said it last week when I was giving a different talk. Is it a different talk? I'm not sure. But I said, when I talked about jouissance, I imagined these monks, these Buddhist monks who in protest set themselves on fire and they die. That's revolutionary activity. They're sitting out in the streets and they're protesting. They're not throwing the Molotov cocktail at the world. They're throwing it at themselves. It's not the world that's burning, they're burning. Lacan once defined jouissance in the following way. He said, it begins with a tickle and it ends in a blaze of petrol. I think that's an exact quote. I repeated it. I said it before, so I think that's right. It begins with a tickle and it ends in a blaze of petrol. And Lacan reminded us that this behavior, well, let's call it the melancholic position, is popular among Buddhists, monks. And he related it to the melancholic position. It's a revolution that I think outlives the subject. That's why I think it's important to understand that there are revolutionary aspirations, but also revolutions of jouissance, or what we might call the revolutionary activity of death drive or something like that. What the melancholic demonstrates is that there's a revolution of jouissance which burns away at the subject. It reveals that the subject is refused in this world and that the world can easily go on about its business without him or her. So the subject is refused, refuse, garbage, waste to the world, piece of trash. And the melancholic subject will state that quite explicitly. I was thinking that it's an interesting position to imagine oneself in, because it's what, in fact, the psychoanalyst ultimately becomes for the patient at the end of psychoanalysis: cast off, rejected, refuse, waste. The analyst is also a piece of trash. Anyway, there's just a couple more things I wanted to say. There's a possible reading of the legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, a different reading, another reading than the one you've heard. What Orpheus learned upon losing Eurydice in the underworld, I think, was that he needed to lose her to convince himself that he ever had her from the beginning. He was trying to trick himself. It's a possible reading. He wanted to be duped. He wanted to forget that, I think, that he already knew the big secret. After losing her, I think he realized he never had her from the beginning. He sat alone beneath a tree, like the Buddha did. Absolutely dedicated to her long after she was gone, long after she vanished. That's what we're told, you know, that his dedication to her never waned. He remained absolutely tethered to her, committed to her. He rejected all possible relationships to any other woman after that. He couldn't substitute her for another. I have a quote from Ovid, for example, quote, "He abstained from the love of women, yet many felt a desire to be joined with him, and many grieved at being rejected," end quote. And what happened in the end? The world tore him to pieces, limb by limb. So it wasn't petrol, but it had the same effect. So I think there's another reading possible, one that thinks that he's a melancholic. He couldn't separate from Eurydice. He couldn't find a position from which to properly mourn her. And the paradox was that she was all the more proximate precisely after she vanished. And maybe it's another way to read the lesson of Antigone. I'm thinking Antigone, the great hero of one of Lacan's seminars, the ethics seminar of all that. This is before he really talks about the ethics of speaking well. At this point, it's a different sort of ethics that's at stake. But many people believe that Antigone is like a revolutionary hysteric who performed this ethical act. Judith Butler noted that she couldn't have been hysterical. She agreed, I think, with Julia Kristeva in claiming that she must have been melancholic, Antigone. Kristeva, I think, advanced the position a little bit further. Antigone was melancholic because she couldn't separate from the familial bond, the brother. She was closer to him precisely in his absence. But she seemed like a revolutionary figure, ungovernable by the laws of the world, transgressive, and all this other stuff. But what kind of revolution is it? The revolution went on without her. She died. I really like how Russell Grigg defined melancholia. I think it was 20 years ago, I don't know, it was quite a while ago. He said that in melancholic psychosis, it's not a process of mourning the loss of an object or a person or whatever. That's not what's at stake. What's at stake is, so it's not a process of mourning the loss of something. Melancholia is about the unbearable presence of an object or person or whatever. You're tethered to them. I think he calls it an unabandoned object or something like that. Okay, I'm going to try and return to the thread. It was a long detour. So I want to return to this moment when Lacan was speaking to the revolutionary students of France. Lacan's statement really did surprise me, and I'll explain why. First of all, it occurred during an impromptu session. Impromptu. Because Lacan, he permitted himself the space to ramble. But the students challenged that space. They challenged the very space within which rambling could have occurred, the space of speech. On the one hand, they demanded that he respond to their provocations, their accusations, perhaps even some insults in there. And on the other hand, they kept interrupting him and in fact spoke for him. They spoke in place of him. When he did find a moment to speak, from what I can gather, it was clear that they only heard what they were already prepared to hear, justifications for their rebellion and so on. They already knew all of the answers to the questions that they were asking. They didn't even give him a chance to answer. So maybe that offers us another way to think about what an impossible profession is. You know, impossible profession, Lacan the teacher. That's what Freud called them, impossible professions: teaching, governing, politics, and psychoanalysis, these three. Maybe teaching is an impossible profession because there was never a world within which the teacher could have possibly been permitted to ramble in the first place. And I think Lacan probably knew that better than most because he was constantly moving around, looking for a place to speak. Where is he speaking now? There's always a question of the place from which he would speak. And it didn't stop him from speaking. He kept speaking. And he kept saying things that continue to astonish us. As for Antigone, she wasn't able to make use of a world after hers clearly disappeared. There was something, and I think there's something ethically wrong, in fact, in claiming that Antigone's action was revolutionary. And that tragedy is at the heart of what psychoanalysis and anarchism have to offer the world. For example, we might think it's courageous when Antigone says, I quote, "I will bury him," her brother, "I will bury him," where, by the way, outside the city, by the way. Quote, "I will bury him myself, even if I die in the act. That death will be a glory. I will sleep with the one I love and be loved by him," end quote. It's interesting. I mean, I'll have to go back to Lacan's ethics seminar to confirm it, but Lacan described Antigone as having the true secret. She possessed the mystery. Yet for Lacan, she was also inflexible. That's his word, I remember it. He called her inflexible, which means fixated, stuck. And at one point, he's even open to the possibility that she's a fascist. That Antigone is a fascist. I think it was he was quoting somebody else, but he didn't reject it. He didn't accept it, but he didn't reject it. She goes beyond the limits of the world. It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of transgression. But when did the transgression happen? It didn't happen suddenly because of an injustice, from what I can tell. I'm kind of shooting from the hip. I'm gonna have to go back. But she said somewhere, didn't she, that her soul died a long time ago. Her soul, her subjectivity died a long time ago. She didn't say that the world died, but that her soul died. And in the same seminar, the ethics seminar of Lacan, before discussing Antigone, Lacan spoke of another melancholic woman, maybe 2 or 3 more times. There was something on his mind with Melancholia. He didn't go into it in depth, but he did talk about Melancholia that year. And he talked about the melancholic woman who acted in relation to what he called something like this, I'm paraphrasing, an overly proximate object. And the example was her brother. And it's later he goes on to discuss Antigone. It shows that he had something of melancholia in mind when he was speaking of Antigone, I think. Maybe it's a leap, I don't know. But the melancholic doesn't know how to find a place for herself in the world. And it has something to do with the fact that she has a strange access to the hysteric's truth. Last week, I was talking for another event, and I made this really foolish distinction. I'm not willing to let it go yet. Maybe I will soon, because a friend of mine told me yesterday that Lacan used the concept of the idiot differently than I'm using it. But I made this sort of distinction. I said that there's different ways to be duped. You can be duped in different ways. You can also be non-duped. And a lot of Lacanians forget that. Lacan was very explicit. There is non-dupery. And the melancholic is a perfect example of it. But I created this distinction between the idiot, the moron, and the stupid person. When you don't see the way in which you're implicated in the world of mastery, let's say you're duped by it, by the world, by discourse, you're an idiot. It's an idiot. And the hysteric's clearly an idiot. The idiot is always determined by the laws of the world, by the world in some, let's say, as Althusser used to say, in the final instance. I call that idiotology, when you're determined by idiotology. It means that you remain trapped in the field of mastery. But it's different. It's a different position than living without a world. Those who live without a world, I call them morons. It sounds really arrogant, but trust me, I'm implicated in one of these positions. We can claim that the moron is an elevated idiot. Elevated. Because the moron's not duped at all. But the moron can't live properly without being duped. The psychoanalyst is interested in a revolution that's neither moronic nor idiotic, I think. I think it says something about our stupidity. Maybe it's about not being without a world, not being without a world. A phrase that's coming back into fashion. I've heard it from Mark a few times, so now I'm starting to use it again. Thanks. Not being without a world, which means you're capable of making use of a world after it's gone missing. The stupid person really likes surprises. I mean, it's right in the word stupid, to be stunned, to be astonished, to be in awe. That's what stupidity is. The stupid person likes surprises, to be stunned. I want to quote Natalie Wolfing, who I think put this stuff really well. Quote, "For the melancholic, there's nothing to be gained from the world." I'm changing a few words. She says the big other, I'm saying world, just my vocabulary. For the melancholic, there's nothing to be gained from the world. Freud, in fact, thought that the melancholic had an uncharacteristic access to the truth. It would cast him as a non-dupe, a moron, end quote. So it's a really terrible thing to say, because one thing I would tell you never to do is to never call a melancholic a moron. It will produce catastrophic consequences. Anyway, okay, I'm going to try and conclude because I never even used the quotes I have up that I want to use. So a few more things. I just want to conclude by reminding you that some anarchists, I think, knew the big secret. And I admire these anarchists very much. Take Max Stirner, Johann Sebastian Schmidt, Saint Schmidt, who wrote that, quote, this isn't a quote, actually, I paraphrased. I don't know the exact quote. It's something like this: revolutions aim at new arrangements, but is this right, Roman? The insurrection leads ourselves to no longer be arranged. Revolutions aim at new arrangements. Insurrections lead toward such that we're no longer being arranged, or something like that. It's something like that anyway. But and you know what's interesting? If you look at the drawing that Engels sketched of the young Hegelians, Stirner is always off to the side. His eyes don't look at the others. It's part of the reason he got that name for himself. He's always at a distance from the world. Stirner wasn't essentially aiming to provoke a master. He was confronting the world as such. His books and his essays basically say something like, I resolve to speak of revolutions without any need of a world anymore, or my space in it. And he finds himself all alone without a world. He is this void, this piece of waste. For example, how does he open his most famous book, The Ego and Its Own? He writes, all things are nothing to me. I'll continue my translation. This isn't the official, like the translations on the internet. This is my translation. What is not supposed to be my thing? First and foremost, the good thing could be also interpreted as cause. Then God's thing, the thing of mankind, of truth, of freedom, of humanity, of justice. Further, the thing of my people, my prince, my fatherland. Finally, even the thing of mind, capital M, concept from philosophy, and 1,000 other things. Only my cause, my thing, is never to be my concern. I take from this passage, from the whole book, there's a fundamental rejection of the world, of the entire field that we can classify as the world. There's nothing left for Stirner except this pure revolutionary impulse. He destroys all objects. And that's how he put it in another essay, an essay on art and religion. I posted it quite a few years ago on the Anarchist Library, so you can go read it. It's one of my favorite pieces from Stirner. Art makes the object, he says, and religion lives only in its many ties to that object. And then he continues. And he continues by stating that he, quote, clearly sets I'll paraphrase him, he clearly sets himself apart from both art and religion, neither enmeshed with an object as in religion, nor making one as in art, but rather I place my pulverizing hand upon all the business of making objects, as well as the whole of objectivity itself, and so I breathe the air of freedom, end quote. It's not an exact quote, but it's something like that. It's a rejection of the world. But more than that, it's a rejection of himself as being represented in that world. He resists being an object of the world, and he resists the objects of the world. So where does it leave him? It leaves him with the truth. His solution was to produce this, I think, self-enclosed circuit of autistic jouissance. He's nothing. Yet when he says he's nothing, it's not lack. He calls himself nothing. I am nothing. But it's not lack, this Lacanian concept of lack that some people use, constitutive lack, some people say. It's not that. When he says it's not nothing as in something missing from the world for Stirner. He's not nothing in the sense of emptiness, as he puts it, but a creative nothing, creative nothing. Out of which I myself as creator create everything, I think is how he says it. He is this void of anarchic jouissance, which is overflowing, which is lawless, enigmatic. He refuses to be captured by what he calls spooks, for example. He's not an object. And it gives us a reason to presume that there's always been something like a revolutionary impulse in the anarchist tradition. But these melancholics don't know how to live without a world or with it. It's why so many melancholics of history, the great melancholics of history, leave us really soon. Too soon. I'm thinking of Mark Fisher suddenly. Lenin was a melancholic. Some claim Freud was melancholic. Some people claim, I mean, Althusser, of course, and on and on and on. But there have been attempts to form a social bond, however paradoxical, from the melancholic position. Stirner spoke of a union of egoists, but we have no idea what the fuck it means. Nobody does. People have tried to intuit it. What is it? It's precisely a void, objet petit a, within the symbolic inscriptions of a world. A particularly good example of the attempt to form a social bond comes from one of my favorites, perhaps my favorite, Sergei Anakiev, Russian, young nihilist anarchist Russian companion of Mikhail Bakunin. Nechayev claimed that he built this large, secret, revolutionary secret society. There's no evidence that he did, but that was the propaganda. Some people claim he influenced Stalin and Lenin and so many others. Well, he influenced me. His manifesto highlighted, I think, what was at stake for him. I'm going to quote it. It's from the Revolutionary Catechism, one of my favorite lines in the history of revolutionary writing. Quote, "The revolutionary is a doomed man. He has no personal interests, no business affairs, no emotions, no attachments, no property, and no name. Everything in him is wholly absorbed in the single thought and the single passion for revolution. The revolutionary knows that in the very depths of his being, not only in words, I would say especially not in words, but also in deeds, he has broken, I've lost the quote, he has broken the bonds which tie him to the social order and the civilized world with all its laws, moralities, and customs, and with all its generally accepted conventions. He is their implacable enemy, and if he continues to live with them, it is only in order to destroy them more speedily," end quote. Seriously, one of the most incredible revolutionary writers. I don't remember when he wrote this. He was very young. Oh, my laptop's going dead. Forgive me. Let me plug it back into the world. Okay. Okay. Okay, what happened next in the manifesto, the Revolutionary Catechism, is that he goes on to discuss, to justify the murder of whole segments of society and himself. More importantly, the revolutionary subject, he insisted, must be prepared to end his own life as a part of the revolutionary process. I even get the sense that he wanted it to happen. The revolution is a pure consequence for him. People consider him to be a consequentialist thinker. However you get to the revolution, it doesn't matter. Some people read Marx that way too, as a consequentialist. I'm not sure it's true, but consequentialism, you know what consequentialism is. It's this idea that whatever it takes, by any means necessary, this will happen. So by any means necessary, a revolution, even if I'm not there, especially if I'm not there, even if it means the loss of the space of subjectivity. Okay, anyway, I'm not sure I agree with everything I've said today. Actually, I'm quite certain I don't agree with everything I've said today. But what I really wanted to do is just to kind of set the stage for and provide some coordinates, mostly to myself, so that I could try and work my way through what I just said and see if there's anything of value in it for the next discussion. Next week, what I want to do is focus not on hysteria necessarily. I don't want to focus on melancholia or on the ways in which I've articulated melancholia today, because I'm not sure I agree with the way I framed melancholia myself. But what I'm interested in is the world that an anarchist might make use of, or what social bond is at stake for anarchism in the future. it's clear to me that revolutionaries cannot be without a world. The revolutionary impulse needs a world, cannot be without a world. The revolutionary impulse cannot be without a world. So if the hysterics world was governed by what Lacan called the nom de père, name of the father, know of the father, nom de père, it's a homophone, supposed to, the sound could mean multiple things, name or know of the father. If the hysterics world was governed by that, by the nom de père, then the revolutionary anarchist, not the revolutionary aspirations, but the impulse, could find a principle of autonomie. Autonomie. It's an expression that I used a very long time ago. I saw that Catherine Malibu used it recently. Autonomie. It's a homophone, which is another way of saying no to the subject in the symbolic. To make use of the nom de père, precisely when it's gone missing. That's autonomie. Maybe autonomie can help us clear a path forward for those of us who want to live beyond the consequences of the revolutionary impulse. I'm going to stop here. I'm happy for there to be a discussion among each other. I would prefer if it were more of a discussion rather than a question answer thing, but whatever you prefer for those of you who are in Zoom. And those of you who are live, if you like to write a question or some comments in the chat there, I can try and find a way to incorporate it next week. I'd be happy to. If there's no thoughts or questions or comments or anything anybody wants to say, I would be more than happy to put an end to it all. Mark? You're muted, my friend. Oh, maybe I have a thing set. Let me see. I think I have a security feature set. So, oh, here we go. You can unmute yourself now. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I'm sort of, as you know, a red Catholic, so from a Marxian tradition, and I'm learning a lot, about Stirner and whatnot. What I was interested about the idea of the melancholic. The melancholic is one. It's synonymous with one all alone, insofar that they are alone. I know that one all alone is a separate concept as well, but altogether, but they are without a world, and they are without a world precisely because of the proximity or the hyper proximity of the other, and that proximity means that they lose place of themselves in the world altogether. But that's from what I understand. For what I was reading Bruce as well, the idea of the analytic act, the idea of in the school, you're going through this, and when the past happens and you realize it retroactive, there's a sort of stripping away completely of all symbolic identities. There is this absolute stripping away, and because of that stripping away altogether, there is this, earlier Lacan calls it subjective destitution, and then it turns into something else. It's the past, or this moment of complete apophasis of subjectivity. To what extent could you say that the analytic act is a type of controlled melancholia, where it accept what happens because of the presence of the school? It allows that type of creation of symbolic as a pure, as not integrated into subjectivity per se, but it allows use. It allows them, so the person who's gone through that, they can utilize the names of the father, they can use, but there is a different relation to it as opposed to, you know, normative subjectivity, hysteria or whatever. Is there something in that, or is that off the mark, would you say?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I know that it's not something that a lot of the people that I know in the clinical tradition are open to. Um, um, I've talked to a few people in the clinic, and I got the sense that it wasn't a thesis they wanted to agree with. I think I'm taking maybe, it's still it's still an inflated position, but it's maybe a bit more modest nonetheless than that one. It would be that there's something of melancholia perhaps in all of us, and I would call that my depressive realist position.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. So I was really interested in what you're saying about Antigone as well. I'm making a comparison between Julian of Norwich and Antigone, and I believe that I was coming out the idea that Antigone was hysteric and a creature of desire, not giving up on their desire, and I was arguing that Julian of Norwich, unlike Antigone, she's already dead before she goes into the cave. She's already dead. She goes into her cell already dead. She has a ritual beforehand, and then from that cell she allows a world to be created. Whilst with Antigone, the world dies outside. So it was interesting listening to that. Give me more to think about. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your talks always. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Vulcan, I just wanted to say one tiny more word in relation to what Mark was saying. I think, one of the things I'm struggling through right now, I mean, literally right now, because I hadn't thought about it before. And if I'm being honest today, I was talking to Julia about that before, because I never really talked about, explored melancholia. So I don't know the literature on it. I really don't. But one thing I can say is that I want to begin from psychosis, from the inexistence of the world, rather than from neurosis, and then think about the loss of a world, which is the position of, say, somebody like Zizek when he talks about the decline of symbolic efficiency and so on. In other words, I begin with this position that is very controversial, but I haven't been able to abandon it yet. It's the thesis of what Jacques-Alain Miller called many years ago, maybe decades, generalized foreclosure. There is something foreclosed for all of us. We're all mad. We're all crazy. And we all have delusions. And the melancholic has delusions. But when we talk about psychosis, maybe not what some people call ordinary psychosis, but melancholia seems to me to be the best place to begin if we're talking about something like what Miller calls ordinary psychosis. There's nonetheless maybe something of a differential, and that's why it's difficult, because I've thought psychosis, ordinary psychosis, these categories, some of you may be not familiar with them. I've thought about them in general terms, but I've never thought about them more in differential terms until literally as I'm speaking right now, which is to say that, okay, come to think of it, when we speak of psychosis, well, let's delineate perhaps three positions without taking them as structural positions, without taking them as pure diagnostic criteria or something like that. Melancholia in the middle, paranoia, and schizophrenia. So we can have schizophrenia, which you might call an extraordinary psychosis. We can have paranoia, where the insults are coming at you, where there's a delusional apparatus, a clear one. And you can have melancholia, where maybe that's less so, and where it's more a question of the subjects, what Lacan called, interestingly enough, in his On a Question Prior essay on psychosis, what he called I can't remember how he put it, I'm going to have to paraphrase it. There's something going on at the core of the subject's world. And I think we really see that in Melancholia, because it's a question of the subject's place, and there seems to be only world in some sense. So I think these are some of the terms that I should have thought through today, but I didn't, and I regret it. Vulcan?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, good. So, well, my question is short, but I also want to segue to what you said about the decline of symbolic efficiency, as opposed to like the neurosis to psychosis. I feel like the decline of symbolic efficiency doesn't necessarily relate to neurosis. It can be, I know it's, so these categorical things, I feel there are there are regions where they bleed into each other, and it becomes confusing. I don't know, it really depends on the individual in terms of the clinical case, where there's a person and that's all about the person really specifically. So like, I really don't know, but I thought about that when you say that.
Vulcan, may I? And then you can continue with your second, because I think you're pointing at something that's really big. And I think you're right, because one of the things that I think of when I think of this notion of, well, it came from Lacan, the decline of symbolic efficiency is a question of where it leads. The decline of the paternal function, the decline of the nom de père, the decline of it leads to psychosis. And so if we're going to follow Zizek's point on the decline of, and this is the position, this is where he goes. He even goes into paranoia. He says it leads to foreclosure in the symbolic, return in the real, which is paranoia. It's psychosis, and he does adopt this thesis of generalized foreclosure. He just kind of forgets it. So I would say that the thesis of the decline of symbolic efficiency you're right, it doesn't have to be neurosis, but where I'm interested in is where it leads us. And where it leads us is to a thesis of foreclosure, of generalized foreclosure. We're in a psychotic world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really think that this dimensional thinking maybe doesn't really apply, or I don't know if it's Zizek's like interest in this quantum mechanics theories and so on. But then it's like, sometimes it's not really either or. I'm not really sure what I'm saying, but this is something interesting for sure. But what I wanted to say is also like, maybe really points to a different dualism, which I really want to hear. We said what was it, the object. I want to understand the relationship of objet petit a with void. Okay, this connection, and also the more like branching the specificity of the connection of the melancholic to void, as opposed to the hysteric to void. Because I see there's a difference, and maybe that's a critical thing. So I don't know. You tell me.
No, I think you're right. I think it's something I have to think through a bit more. Obviously, I was making maybe I'm making a bit of a leap, and I'm saying, well, if there's a void in the symbolic, there's something missing, something that cannot be inscribed. And if it can't be inscribed, this is my logic, right? Then it's enigmatic. And if it's enigmatic, we're probably in the field of drive and jouissance, and there's something there. So maybe not, but that's where I was kind of going. I think you're pointing at something. You're right. I have to think through a little bit more rigorously. Mark?
I forgot to put my hand down. I apologize. But no, I just want to, I think it's important to think things through like this, the consequences of it in a world that repeatedly condemns itself, and there's this logic of that we see all around us, the world's ending, everything. There is this air of endless condemnation. And, as Vulcan's pointed out, the deficiency in the symbolic, we have to be able to think through what's that mean. And yes, we can talk about the not all, and that's that's trendy because it's sort of in between, and or most ways of speaking about the not all always seems to be in relation to the neurotic subject structures. But we don't talk about that, the not all in relation to psycho, because we can't. But it can lead in just the same places. You know, it's these idea of melancholia, psychosis, paranoia, as you've pointed out. But it's the point that you're trying to get off, and I can see it. So how can we maintain or create a social bond from there? How can we start? It's like what Zizek says all the time. Let's go to the end. You know, he uses that rhetorical point. Let's go to the end. Well, what end is bigger than melancholia? You know, it's the end, because they know the truth. Yeah.
But Mark, that's precisely the problem in Melancholia. There's no end.
Oh, okay. Well, it's I thought what the literature I've read is that the melancholic knows that they're condemned by the other. They know that that's why the angel, that they know that they're dead already. They know that they've got no name. There's no symbolic. There's no end. I don't know. Is that a different interpretation? Have you put it, or
No, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
That's it. No, I didn't even have my hand up, and I got. Now I'm speaking. Now I'm rambling. It's all right. But you were rambling anyway. I really enjoyed it. You know, I thought it was great. It was really interesting stuff. And I thought Vulcan pointed out some interest. So, what did the Vulcan? You talk about the relationship between void and hysteria. What can you unpack that a little bit for me, Vulcan? What you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah. So the of course, like when Duane was talking about the difference between melancholic and hysteric, and I feel like there is a different topology in either cases, and so like void, it's void wherever you approach it from. It's the void, but I guess depending on your standpoint, it gets a different notion. But I don't know if it's even possible to talk about, for this thing for in a very generalized way. So I don't really know. But since this is like a theory, and it has a form, and I'm wondering what Duane was thinking about, because like I will shortly end. I shared the link. This is a documentary in a zip file, which is about the life and music of a jazz drummer who recently died earlier last year. And he incorporates this kind of enigmatic kind of playing, which he himself even doesn't know what happens, but then that's a kind of a spirit of the music, and that's kind of spirit of that kind of genre which occurred after 70s. And then this is interesting because, like, in a way there is a very deliberate function of doing this kind of complexifying it, and that's kind of the way which in this case this art form, which is music, happens. And there's more to learn, if you watch the documentary. And Milford Graves is the name of the drummer. Sorry.
No, I said I'll give it a watch. Yeah, I'll watch it.
Yeah, totally do it. I think I feel like, and yeah, maybe he taps into hysteria, but he's not a hysteric for sure. He's really conscious. He knows. But then there's all this other dimension. So I feel like it's really much more complicated. Maybe that domain. I don't know. Like, I have my own experience that I can only talk about, and some little reading of literature, which is not really so significant. But then this void, I mean, that's kind of the interesting subject for me. So, and in music and in art, but also in terms of what's being talked about, paranoia or schizophrenia. That's I don't know, like this kind of separation. And I'm always cynical, but then I'm happy to learn more. And yeah, that's.
No, thank you. It makes sense. And yeah, I mean, I've been sort of doing work. I've been doing a specific essay now for Duane on apophatic psychoanalysis, and my main thing has been stuck in looking at the not all, and that relates to sort of object petit a, and you know, and permutations of the void and all those things. But the question coming up with this, it threw me off, and it's like, oh my gosh, haven't I been thinking about melancholia? But then there is, you know, there is this thing where I think Alistair Duncan points this out, is that we do have this neurosis-centric way of looking at things, because that's the world we live in. It's a neurotic world, and a subset of neurosis is to do with hysteria. As soon as we're looking at those things, then we're dealing with questions of desire, and desire, as always, comes with a question, and that question's, you know, looks towards object A. And the way I understood it, this is my very own basic way of what melancholia and psychosis is that the world structure, or when I say world, I don't mean objective world, I mean life world, our subjectivity itself, how we engage and see things, and how it's that structure, that unconscious structure that's there for us as subjects has dissipated, or it's not fully there, it falls away. And so what you have is not a type of you don't ever, not everything, there isn't this complete destitution. What happens is meaning floods in. You are literally saturated with meaning. The psychotics world is one where there's no doubt everything's up in their face. It's there is no nom de pierre that allows a type of space for desire to exist, or the object A to exist. So I suppose the other way is that everything becomes void in a way with psychosis. But the thing is, and I'm going to, the last book I read on madness was Darian Leader's book on madness. Have you that's what I read recently, and but I think Dwayne's probably read a lot I have in that book. It's a decent book, but I know that Darian Leader, he gets a bit of flack as well. Either way, I'm going to stop rambling. So thank you very much for your thoughts on that, Volkan.
Thank you, Mark. I just would have one thing to add, or two. Well, two. The what I mean by the melancholic, this is what I know through, you know, the Albrecht Dürer Melancholia, the etching. This you know, is an absolute meaning of melancholia. I'm referring to that, and that's what I feel like. That's quite old already, and that's kind of what I feel like. It's a divine checkpoint, is a divine reference I have of melancholia. Today we have a different world, but I feel like, yeah, that's a nice anchor. And also a book about madness. There's a book that's quite recent, actually, that's out, and it's by Bruce Lamar, I think his name is.
Bruce Lamar. Okay.
Do you know him?
No. I'm just trying to remember the name.
And the name of the book is I don't remember at the moment, but I will write into the chat like in a few minutes. It's about it's from Duke University Press, and it's quite interesting because it's about a trumpet player who lived who was from 19th century, and whose playing style and influence through which was all this jazz was born, but his name is never known because he was like put in this insane asylum for like, I don't know, over near 40 years, and there are like eyewitness accounts of kind of playing he was doing and things like that in the book, which is really strong, and some also really old images. That's very interesting. But the book I read about madness, and he takes it from, you know, the bipolar and to schizophrenic. He talks about all these things in a different way than, you know, what is in the text of Lacan or, you know, other contemporary philosophers. But then it's kind of interesting. So I will quickly check. Meanwhile, I think Dwayne wanna wrap up because we're out over time. But thank you for your also remarks. It's interesting to hear the point, your points about the relationship to void. That's something I want to think more on later.
Same. Same.
And remember also that the void as objet petit a in the hysterics discourse, it's the truth. It's in the position of truth, objet petit a, which is the bottom left side. And the void can also be a defense against jouissance. And this is a point that a lot of people make. So it's a question of what Lacan meant at that particular moment. And I don't know, because if I'm being honest, I hadn't read the seminar to prepare for today, and I'm not sure if he invoked the concept of the void or not. So it's something maybe to get us working and to do some, so that we can do some more research. There's also a distinction we should note, of course, in a lot of literature today between lack, whole, void, whole and void not being exactly the same thing for a lot of people. And maybe these are some concepts that we can work through as well. As for Max Stirner, it's not his name.
Not his name. No, it's not.
Not his given name. He took on the name of Stirner because that's what others called him, Stern. Anyway, so thanks for coming, everybody. If anybody wants to make some comments, have some questions, have some thoughts addressed for next week in one way or another, please leave them in the chat for the event page. And I know I will at least look at it, if not everybody else, and we can see what it can do to us. Thanks again. So nice to see all of you. Bye, everyone.
Take care, Dwayne.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye, Valeria.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sophia. Bye. Roman.